talk about being tone deaf. After the historic British vote to ditch the globalist European Union superstate, the increasingly embattled EU appears to be doubling down on its anti-sovereignty extremism with the political equivalent of let them eat tyranny. Among other schemes, leading EU member governments are threatening fellow members with an ultimatum amid a push to abolish the remaining vestiges of nationhood. One reporter described the extreme plot, unveiled this week, as a plan to morph EU nations into a giant superstate. According to Polish authorities and media reports, the socialist French government and German Chancellor Angela Merkel have presented a scheme to Eastern European nations demanding a full-blown political union. Under the scheme, control over everything from immigration, taxation, and economic policy to military, intelligence, and law enforcement would be centralized in the unelected bureaucracies of Brussels that essentially rule Europe today by decree. But outrage is growing as the controversial EU's very existence increasingly comes into question post-Brexit, in addition to the possibility of a domino effect with other nations voting to leave. The preamble to the controversial integration agenda put out by the German and French governments reads sort of like a mafia invitation to pay protection money in exchange for security. Our two countries share a common destiny and a common set of values that provide the foundation for an ever closer union between our peoples, the document's introduction claims, despite the fact that voters have consistently rejected the extremism when they have been given a chance. We will therefore move further towards political union in Europe and invite the other Europeans to join us in this endeavor. The ultimatum was reportedly presented to authorities in Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Slovakia at a meeting in Prague by German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier. Socialist French Foreign Minister Jean-Marc Ayrault was apparently also intimately involved with the scheme. However, despite the threats, at least some Eastern European officials were not nearly as enthusiastic as their ultra-unpopular counterparts in Germany and France. So outrageous were the demands, in fact, that Polish Foreign Minister Witold Waszczykowski blasted them in public statements, revealing the agenda to the world. This is not a good solution, of course, because from the time the EU was invented a lot has changed. Waszczykowski was quoted as saying by Polish broadcaster TVP. The mood in European societies is different. Europe and our voters do not want to give the Union over into the hands of technocrats. Therefore, I want to talk about this, whether this really is the right recipe right now in the context of a Brexit. That appears to have been a diplomatic way of saying something along the lines of "Are you people totally nuts?" Among the most inflammatory elements of the Franco-German plot exposed this week is the final usurpation of control over immigration and refugee policy by the EU. Under the plan, all of that would also be set in Brussels, essentially abolishing what remains of national borders and forcing every once sovereign European nation in the EU to accept the extraordinarily unpopular and dangerous flood of migrants unleashed on the West, largely by German authorities and former East German communist propagandist Angela Merkel. As the New American has documented extensively, the chaos caused by the sudden influx of millions of Muslims, many from nations destroyed with help from Western militaries, is being exploited by the very same globalist forces that unleashed the crisis to begin with. The proposal makes clear where all of it is going, if the internationalist extremists get their way. There shall be no unilateral national answers to the migration challenge, the proposal states, with unilateral referring to measures taken by a national government without approval from the unelected EU bureaucrats in Brussels. The governments in Germany and France are convinced that it is high time to work towards establishing truly integrated European asylum, refugee and migration policy. A situation in which the burden of migration is unevenly carried by a limited number of member states is unsustainable. The scheme also includes a plan to revise what is known as the Dublin policy, which is supposed to ensure that self-described refugees, real and fake, are processed by the government of the EU country in which they first arrive, rather than allowing them to travel around the continent seeking the best deal. However, The radical plan is likely to face fierce opposition, potentially further fracturing the imploding EU. Consider that the refugee tsunami has already been denounced by fellow EU leaders in the strongest possible terms. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, for example, recently warned that the immigration wave was in reality a coordinated EU plot to undermine Christianity and nation-states by dangerous internationalist fanatics based in Brussels, enemies of freedom who he said were far more dangerous than the millions of male Muslim migrants the extremists deliberately unleashed on the Western world. Orbán also blasted what he referred to as a treasonous conspiracy to abolish the Christian West on the road to world order. Apparently realizing that the public was fed up beyond the point of no return, even some top globalist EU leaders have urged the globalists to cool it. European Council President Donald Tusk, for instance, warned in the weeks before Brexit that Europeans were not as enthusiastic as their rulers about a utopia of Europe without conflicting interests and ambitions, a utopia of Europe imposing its own values on the external world. A utopia of Euro-Asian unity. Pointing to the increasingly loud denunciations of a united Europe, Tusk even said the spectre of a breakup is haunting Europe, and imposing a federation did not seem to him like the best answer to the problem. Tusk's native Poland is today ruled by conservatives skeptical of the EU, globalism, and especially the massive influx of Middle Eastern and African immigrants. Eurozone boss Jerome Dijsselbloem echoed those concerns, if only in the interest of preserving what the globalists have achieved so far in terms of subjugating the formerly independent peoples of Europe. We need to strengthen what we have and finish it, but let's not build more extensions to the European house while it is so unstable, he was quoted as saying. He also tossed cold water on the radical idea being pushed by the most fanatical globalists, who are now demanding a full political union and completion of the monetary union, as well as a euro area economic government or even a euro budget. Instead, globalists should focus on holding their gains, rather than risk it all by pushing for more globalism, faster, he suggested. Perhaps Merkel and the Socialist Party ruling France never got the memo. Ironically, billionaire Rothschild protégé George Soros, a key architect of the refugee crisis, appeared to be more willing to acknowledge reality than many of the establishment politicians who have been doing his bidding. For example, in a June 25 column on the consequences of the Brexit, the radical statist said that the disintegration of the EU is now practically irreversible. Brexit will open the floodgates for other anti-European forces within the Union, Soros added, pointing to the National Front's demand for a Frexit and anti-Islamist Dutch political leader Geert Wilders of the Freedom Party's call for an exit. Despite all the fear-mongering and hysteria of doom for Britain, Soros also said the implications for Europe could be far worse. The EU, he concluded, is heading for a disorderly disintegration. And while Soros added that globalists should not give up and should get on with thoroughly reconstructing the EU, if Brexit showed anything, it is that the globalists can be defeated. When even the ultimate establishment insider admits what would seem to be obvious, that the EU is toast, it is certainly bizarre to see establishment globalists in Germany and France further inflame the situation by pushing for a full-blown totalitarian regime to rule over Europe. However, as more than a few analysts have warned, the globalists are hardly going to surrender simply because they lost the Brexit battle. Brits will have to be diligent to guard against the deception that is coming next, argued Tim Porter of Circumspect News, which tracks the process of regionalization on the road to what globalists refer to as their New World Order. The globalist establishment is adept at creating crises. More than once it has been willing to concede a step backward in order to take 2 steps forward in its trek toward a world order of regional and continental jurisdictions. Of course, the plot to impose a superstate on Europe was part of the globalist agenda all along, despite the lies its ringleaders offered for public consumption. It was backed, openly and secretly, by top US globalists and political leaders, often using American taxpayer funds. subjugating the continent under an unaccountable superstate will remain on the agenda, with the EU, or potentially its successor, serving as the globalists' prized accomplishment. It also serves as a model for imposing autocratic regional regimes on Africa, South America, Eurasia, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, North America, and more. However, the Brexit shows that the globalists do not always win, and can, in fact, be defeated. Europeans, Americans, and people around the world should stand strong and learn from the lessons provided by